نحن مخرجين للضبط.
هاي تل الربيع، شوف تم تسميتها تل الربيع رمز احتلال يافا. كانت يافا هون بس صارت تل الربيع.
هاي أرض الميعاد، هم بفكروا اليهود إنها ميعاد إلهم، لكن هي ميعاد لتجميعهم للقضاء عليهم بأمر رب العباد.
لقد بنيت خطتي على نار الحقد والكراهية التي تملأ قلوب اليهود نحو محمد وأتباعه.
على ضياع هيبتنا بسبب محمد.
Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's architect of the campaign to brand the Jewish people as a subhuman race in Nazi Germany, was quoted as saying, "If a lie is repeated often enough, then the people will believe it." A similar tactic is being used today in the propaganda war waged against Israel by Islam and the pro-Palestinian factions in the Middle East.
لكن نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يمليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا، لأن القدس هي عربية، وأن فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربية فلسطينية إسلامية، وستبقى كذلك رغم أنف هذا المحتل اللعين.
At the heart of the propaganda war against Israel is the use of fake history and lawfare, the revision and deliberate misrepresentation of international law. Whose Land is a documentary film looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law. Join me, Richard Kemp, in the two-part documentary film Whose Land, as we uncover the true story behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Hello, I'm Barry Shaw, and this is The View from Israel. As many of you know, I like emphasizing certain individuals who have dedicated themselves and their resources to dealing with certain important aspects of making the case for Israel. Call it Zionism if you like, but facts, legitimacy are all important. And that's why today I'm delighted to have a guest, that Hugh Kitson, the filmmaker Hugh Kitson. Welcome to the show, Hugh.
It's a real privilege and a delight to be with you today. Thank you, Barry.
I want to tell you that you have a huge fan club, because I mentioned to the side a number of people that I was looking forward to interviewing you, and a lot of people are raring to watch our conversation today. So Hugh, your movie, Whose Land, it's a documentary produced by you and narrated by Colonel Richard Kemp, which examines the claims to the land of Israel through the eyes of historians and international lawyers. And it's received the seal of approval from the UK Lawyers for Israel. Hugh, you made this historic and legal case for Israel. Why did you dedicate so much of your life and resources into producing this movie?
Well, believe it or not, I first had the vision to do this film some 30 years ago, back in the early 1990s. And what I saw at this time, and this is, by the way, before the Oslo Accords, just before the Oslo Accords, what I saw at the time was that Israel's history was being rewritten. And consequently, I felt that the only way to combat this was to tell the truth. And so I first wrote an outline for this documentary based on a book, actually a Christian friend of mine called Murray Dixon. He wrote a book at about that time, late 80s, early 90s, about the time of the first Gulf War, a book called Whose Promised Land. And we eventually changed the title from Whose Promised Land for the film to Whose Land, because it's an actual fact. It's not just simply a promised land, which of course it is, right back from the biblical days, but it is actually Israel's possession. And so there was a real need to get this thought across. Now, as time went on, I began to realize through an organization called the European Coalition for Israel, who had a 90th anniversary of the San Remo conference at the Villa d'Evesham, which is actually the venue where the original conference took place in 1920. And we began to realize actually that the San Remo resolution and the mandate that came out of it was an international treaty, and the rights given to the Jewish people were enshrined in international law in a treaty. And of course, that also needed to be made public, because what the detractors of Israel, namely the Palestinian leadership and the whole BDS movement, are doing today is to try and delegitimize the existence of the Jewish state, when in fact it's enshrined in international law. And so, it's a question of getting, it's the old blood libels and the whole, what happened in the 1930s coming to pass again. And it was Goebbels who said, if a lie is repeated often enough, then the people will believe it. And sadly, that's exactly what's happening today.
Yes, you're right, because the opening scenes of your movie, Whose Land, in my opinion, are disturbing, because it's full of Arab disinformation that is fueling the conflict today. I couldn't help but being moved by listening to the lies being made by the Arab representatives in the opening scenes of your movie, and what we're all facing today, whether it's on the campuses, whether it's a lot of European parliaments, or wherever the BDS movement or anti-Israel activism is alive and kicking. So it was almost like a moment of genius for you to open it with the Arab disinformation and lies, which went back in history, which are being perpetrated today.
Well, do you know, one of the reasons we did that was because I was just hoping that perhaps if someone from the other side or that inclination watched the film, they would actually continue watching it. And we've had a couple of showings where people who thought they might get the answer as to whose land is it, hoping it might be the Palestinians, who have actually begun to watch it. But when there's a scene about 20 minutes into the long version where Richard Kemp, our presenter, is in Jerusalem, and you can see the Mount of Olives behind him, and he begins to look at some of the evidence that we have presented in the film, that there was no entity back in the mid-19th century, there was no entity that have been discovered historically by the historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists who have been working with the Palestine Exploration Fund, as it was then, who had ever discovered an Arab entity known as the Palestinians. And so that's about 20 minutes into the full version. And that's a point where people actually get up and walk out if they're not prepared to learn the truth. So there we are. But the other aspect of this is that a lot of Jewish people have learned a lot through it too.
I think that's very important, and I want to tell you, part of my battle today is to deprive the BDS movement and the anti-Israel defamers of claiming that we have an illegal illegally occupying entity or whatever, and really that Palestine was Palestine. Whenever anybody had a recent experience of this, somebody was going to visit Rome, and I said, you have to go to the Roman Forum and go and visit the Arch of Titus and take a couple of photographs of it. Because the Palestinian claims that we have deprived and robbed them of their inheritance. But if you go to the Arch of Titus, you will see what happened to the Jews of Palestina, renamed by the Romans 2,000 years ago, who got driven into slavery. And you can see the menorah from the temple and other Jewish emblems. And I tell the BDS movement, go and visit the Arch of Titus, and when you come back and show any signs of the Palestinian treasures that have been dragged away by the Romans, come back to me and speak to me again. So you can go back 2,000 years to see, who had the kingdom of Israel at the time of the Romans, who destroyed the temple, didn't destroy any mosque, for instance.
Yes. Well, I've seen the Titus Arch and photographed it myself. But what Hadrian did after the Bar Kokhba uprising, which he brutally put down, his motivation was to try and erase Israel from history, which is why he renamed that territory, the land of Israel, as Syria Palestina. And he was also wanting to do the same with Jerusalem, and he renamed that Alia Capitolina. But I think to some degree the Christian tradition with Jerusalem prevailed there. So the name Alia Capitolina never stuck, but unfortunately Palestine did. And even some of our Christian Bibles with maps in the back today, and maps from the time of Jesus, they call it Palestine. Well, of course, it was never known as Palestine until the 2nd century of the Common Era. And so this misinformation actually does go back a long, long way. And actually, the Ottoman Turks never called it Palestine. They called it the province of southern Syria. That's what they referred to it as. And the interesting thing is the Palestinians, as we know them today, PA Arabs, if you like, Palestinian Authority Arabs, they were never known as Palestinians. The people who were known as the Palestinians during the Mandate period actually were the Jews. And the Arabs actually didn't like the word Palestinian. We're Arabs, they used to say. So it really started with the Palestine Liberation Organization of the 1960s, and that's where the whole narrative began. And not too many people either know it or even want to know it.
Well, you're right, because I make the point all the time that when you look back prior to 1948, 1920s, 30s, 40s, at that time, if you talk about the Palestine Electric Corporation, the Palestine Bank, the Palestine football team, they're all Palestine Post. They were all creations of the Jews, the Zionists who were developing the land at that time. It was almost like a disgrace for the Arabs to call themselves Palestinians. That was quite insulting. But your first part of your movie deals with the legitimacy of Israel. You mentioned, of course, the San Remo conference in 1980, which went on to become the League of Nations, where all the world bodies officially decreed mandates for various countries, and the mandate for Palestine was front and center of that, to be the Jewish national home of the Jewish people. And then we'll go on to chapter 2 in your movie, which dealt with the Ottoman Turkish period, the Ottoman rule over Palestine, which was basically a backwater at that time. Talk to me a few words about the Ottomans' rule of that prior to coming into this period, First World War I.
Right. Well, the Ottoman I should say that after the Spanish Inquisition, the Ottomans actually welcomed the Jews into the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there were a number living there anyway. But as time went on and we got into the 19th century, the Ottomans really started to persecute non-Turkish minorities. And of course, that includes the Jewish people. And we know that the Ottomans murdered well over 1 million Armenians during the First World War. And one has to ask the question, had the Allies not dismembered the Ottoman Empire, what would have happened to the Jewish population of the Ottoman Empire had it continued? Would they have been treated in the same way as the Armenians and various other minorities, Christian minorities like the Syrian Copts and the Maronites and so on? And so the conquest of the Ottoman Empire and the dismember of the Ottoman Empire, I believe, was entirely justified. And one of the interesting things is that the Allies had been fighting on the Eastern Front for a while. There was Gallipoli in 1915, and the first major victory was the Battle of Beersheba on the 31st of October 1917, and that was the door opener to the Allied powers taking the whole of what was then known as Palestine and Syria, and freeing it up. Now, the interesting thing is that on the 31st of October 1917, that was the day the War Cabinet met in Whitehall to finalize the wording of what became known as the Balfour Declaration. And it's miraculous that actually that victory on the ground in Beersheba was taking place simultaneously with the charge of the Australian Light Horse. And, you know, without that victory, the Balfour Declaration would have meant nothing. It could never have been implemented. So it was that victory that enabled that to happen and for the Allies to go up and on up to Jerusalem and take Jerusalem, and then eventually free the whole of the Ottoman Empire right up to the border of Turkey. And the interesting thing was that surrender of the Ottoman Empire happened exactly 1 year later, on the 31st of October 2018. But the Ottoman Turks had to be defeated and ejected from the land of Israel. Otherwise, there'd be no Israel today. And another thought, and it's a frightening one, had the Ottoman Turks still been around when the Nazis were in power, well, one's imagination just beggars belief. It's a horrific thought. It's something I wouldn't want to think about.
Well, you're right, you mentioned this, but actually, as you probably see by a couple of books I've written here, I wrote a couple of books, 1917, from Palestine to the Land of Israel, also A Tale of Love and Destiny, in which I delve into the history of the time. And you mentioned, for instance, the Armenian Genocide and the potential of doing this to the Jews in Palestine. In fact, Jamal Pasha did begin the first steps of having a genocide against the Jews. He had already made 2 massive expulsions of Jews from Palestine by boat from Jaffa to Egypt. In one of those deportations, in fact, David Ben-Gurion got deported. But at the time, because of the nearly spy ring, Sarah Aronson, the only woman ever to leave a major spy ring in wartime, on her journey back from Constantinople, from Istanbul to Palestine, to Zichron Yapa, to return to the home and to the work that her brother Aaron Aronson had been doing, had witnessed the Armenian genocide personally. And she was there running the spy ring when in fact Jamal Pasha began to deport the Jews from Jaffa and Tel Aviv and ordered them to march north to an area in northern Syria that Sarah Aronson was intimately involved in, because she had passed through that time and saw the bodies of the Armenians that had been deported there by the Ottoman Turks, by the Pashas. And she reported to her brother who was with the general staff in Egypt. The British general staff did nothing. In fact, Aaron Aronson had to take it to the British, and the British somehow brought it to the Americans, and the Americans had put the pressure actually on the Germans, because America wasn't involved in the First World War, that it was a German general who would then have dissuaded Jamal Pasha from moving and deporting the Jews, which was part of his plan to create the Jewish genocide in Palestine at that time, and it stopped. So this is a part of history that isn't well known, and I'm delighted that you mentioned it in your movie. What I'd like to ask you to speak about is, we talked about, again, the San Remo Conference and the League of Nations, but prior to that, there was the Paris Peace Conference, in which an agreement was met and signed between Faisal and Weizmann about how Faisal would be prepared to recognize the dream, the desire, the establishment of the homeland in Palestine, as long as he was rewarded by the mandated powers at the time. Speak to me a little bit about that.
Well, this really is a forgotten piece of history. And it's something that I think is strategically ignored. Okay, it's true that the Arabs later reneged on it, but it was on the eve of the Paris Peace Conference that Faisal and Weizmann met, and there was actually a signed agreement, which we cover this in Whose Land, where the two of them actually did sign an agreement, and at the Paris Peace Conference, they gave their separate deputations to the principal Allied powers. I believe Faisal was on the 6th of February 1919, and then on the 27th, 3 weeks later, Weizmann, and their territorial claims did not actually conflict with one another. And they sort of discussed a border, the eastern border of the homeland, the Jewish homeland, would be just west of the Hejaz Railway. So there was some land east of the Jordan River, which would have been part of the Jewish homeland, and then everything to the east of the Hejaz Railway would be Arab territory. And that was the broad agreement that they came to, which was taken into consideration at the San Remo Conference. Now, the final borders of between the mandates, and in particular the mandate of Palestine and Mesopotamia, and also to Syria and Lebanon, were actually not defined at the San Remo Conference. They decided at the San Remo Conference that the principal Allied powers, in consultation with the League of Nations, would decide those borders. And as I understand it, those borders were not finalized until the Cairo Peace Conference of March 1921. And that was when Churchill drew a line down the Jordan Valley, and everything to the east of that was promised to the Hashemite kingdom, and everything west of that was intended for the Jewish national home.
My feeling of this is that the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan have been living a charmed life going back beyond even 1948 until today. And it beggars my belief on a daily basis that we hear all these nonsensical disinformation that we are illegally occupying Palestine. And I make this point constantly today because it's still up for grabs, I think, today. That in fact, why aren't these people who are supposed to be supporting the Palestinians not decrying the illegal occupation of Arab Palestine east of the River Jordan? Because even today, the Hashemites is barely a minority of 10%. The Hashemites came from Mecca and Medina in the south, but they were rewarded, as you rightly say, by the British. And yet there's never been the argument that those who profess to support the Palestinians, who represent possibly 80% of the people in Jordan, even today, Abdallah, a fine gentleman, right? But his wife is a Palestinian. In other words, the Queen of Jordan is a Palestinian. Where is not the uproar of the pro-Palestinians? If you wanted a land of yourself, you have one east of the River Jordan, and it's been there for all the time. And you know what? Even when the Jordanians invaded the nascent state of Israel, after it had been recognized in the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, and drove across the River Jordan and occupied all of the nation state of Israel, up to and including Jerusalem, and deported the Jews from East Jerusalem and all the Jews from the old city, and destroyed the synagogue from 1948 to 1967, they never in that time opened their mouths once and said, this land belongs to the Palestinians. Never spoken about. Can you address that issue? And perhaps this is something you could raise in your second movie, Whose Land Part 2.
Well, of course, that's where we begin, because there was an illegal occupation west of the Jordan River, and that was when Jordan invaded, not only Jordan, but other Arab armies invaded the nascent state of Israel, with the intention of just simply wiping it out. There had been a call for jihad in the lead up to Israel's independence, and the Arab League's nations were wanting to wipe out the Jewish presence from the historic land of Israel. But there was an illegal occupation from 1948 to 1967. And I mean, you were talking about the Palestinians. Well, as an entity, the Arab Palestinians didn't exist as we understand them today until the 1960s. And in fact, when the PLO was formed, Jordan was still occupying what the Palestinians call as now occupied Palestinian territory. And I think the most disgraceful thing is that we, Britain, as the mandatory power, go along with that. It's the only occupation was, illegal occupation, was from 1948 to 1967. Now, the first part of Whose Land, we've divided it up into episodes. And so we've just completed the first 10-minute segment of part 2. It's about to get released, and we look at the illegality, first of all, of the Arab invasion. It was a flagrant violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter, which is all about non-aggression and peaceful resolution of conflicts. And actually, the Arab invasion was every bit as illegal as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Russians are out to seize territory and to try and destroy the Ukrainian identity. Well, that's exactly what was happening in 1948. The Arabs invaded and were out to actually just to really kick the Jewish presence out, and that's exactly what happened in the territory they conquered, particularly the old city of Jerusalem, which had been continuously inhabited by Jews from the time of the Babylonian exile, except for a 200-year period after the Bar Kokhba uprising, when they were barred from Jerusalem, there had been a Jewish community living in the walls of the old city continuously. And of course, it was the historic capital of the Jewish nation as it is today. And the shocking thing is that not only was Britain arming and training the Jordanians and the Egyptians, but the Jordanian army, the Arab Legion, was led by a serving British Army general, Sir John Bagot Glubb, otherwise known as Glubb Pasha. And as a serving British Army officer, he would have had to have been under the orders of Whitehall. And so Britain actually militarily led this invasion. Now, the United Nations never denounced the invasion, and it's slightly incongruous that, okay, today Russia's one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council with the power of veto, and so the Security Council is never going to be able to pass a resolution condemning Russia, or even a Chapter 7 resolution ordering Russia out of Ukraine. Well, with Britain as one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council then, with the power of veto, a condemnation of the Arab invasion was never likely to come from the United Nations. And so one of our lawyers who's in Part 2, Andrew Tucker, he's the director of an organization called the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, THINK. He actually says that Britain was in breach of the UN Charter in backing that invasion. So in every sense, the Jordanian invasion and annexation of Judea, Samaria, and Jerusalem was illegal. And this is a crucial part of the narrative and the argument today that the war against Israel, which of course continues to this day, had an illegal foundation from the very beginning. And this is, we're about to release this first episode of Part 2. It's called episode 11, actually, because there are 10 in Part 1. And we're about to release this. And if we get the funding, we can then continue on from there, because in the next little episode, we look at the armistice lines. What do they mean legally today? Because it was actually in Jordan's insistence at that time in 1949 that they were not to be regarded as international borders. And I believe Jordan at that time had an ulterior motive in that they wanted to push those borders back even further and diminish the Jewish state to nothing, if at all possible. So they're not legally recognized boundaries at all, even though the UN claims that they are. A very interesting thing, actually, and Andrew Tucker makes this comment in this episode. He basically says that any UN resolution that endorses what happened in 1948, 1949, actually is in violation of the UN Charter. So take, for instance, UN Security Council Resolution 2334, and this is something we cover later in Part 2, which is not binding in international law, although some claim it is. But the interesting thing is it's actually contradictory to the UN's own founding charter and the rights given to the Jewish people in Article 80.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit later on about Resolution 2334, but you recently had an event in Parliament about this, the notion about the British betrayal of the mandate. Tell me about the agenda, how this event in Parliament took place, who were the speakers there on behalf of yourself and the Jews and the Jewish people?
Right. Well, here in Britain, there's a coalition of Christian organizations. It's called Love Never Fails. It's been going for over 20 years, and I used to be very involved in it, not so much these days. And they are the ones who've actually organized this, who organized this commemoration of the centenary of the mandate. And it happened on the 6th of July because Parliament breaks up for the summer recess. And the speakers there were Lord Turnberg, who is a Jewish member of the House of Lords, a man called Shia Charsit, who is a survivor, Holocaust survivor, who was deported on the ship Exodus in 1947 and sent back to Germany. So he's one of the speakers, and also Andrew Tucker, who's going to look at the legal aspect of the mandate and how it applies today. So that's what that is all about. And I was given the opportunity to give away DVDs of Whose Land. So this is important. Now, one of the things that I've been working on, and a lot of Christians have been working on in this country, is the fact that there needs to be a formal apology by the British government to the nation of Israel, to the Israeli government, for the way in which we betrayed the mandate. And, you know, it's absolutely true that without the British mandate, there would be no state of Israel today. And you know, what our leaders did 100 years ago, David Lloyd George, Arthur Balfour, and many others, they had this vision for the restoration of the Jewish nation. And by the way, it's written in the mandate document that the right is given for the Jewish people to reconstitute their national home. So it's not a question of being given a new right, but a pre-existing right is being recognized. Now, the sad thing is that we went back on that with the 1939 white paper, and even before that, but basically we betrayed the mandate completely. And there is a need for an apology by the British government. And so this has been a stepping stone. This is something we've been working on for years. Now, a former British Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, actually did admit at a Holocaust Remembrance Day event in the Foreign Office back in 2019, and I was there. I witnessed him saying this. He said that the 1939 White Paper was a dark stain on British history. Well, that is the first admission by the British government I've ever heard to that flavor, that in fact it was a betrayal, but in fact it was much more than that. But because of the white paper, at least hundreds of thousands of Jewish people who could have escaped Nazi Europe were locked up there and perished because they could not come to their promised land, which Britain was mandated. Actually, we were in breach of international law in keeping them out. So there is the need for an apology, and hopefully something will come of this meeting in Parliament on the 6th of July.
Firmly of the belief that the spirit of Hajj Amin al-Husseini is alive and killing today, 100 years after he whipped up the Arab riots in the old city of Jerusalem under the guise of the Nebi Musa festivities. Talk to us briefly about the British role in enabling Hajj Amin al-Husseini to express his anti-Semitism, the role of Haj Amin al-Husseini, where he escaped from Palestine and the British and went to Iraq, and then to today's role, let's say?
Well, I think we've got a very unfortunate, well, it's evil, unfortunate's not the right word, legacy from that. I have to say that actually, after Britain had taken charge of Jerusalem, for the first 2 and a bit years, there was a military administration. And the governor at that time, the military governor, was a man called General Bowles. And basically, the British military were anti the Balfour Declaration. They weren't prepared to implement it. And a group of British Army officers, which included Colonel Waters Taylor, decided that they would try and torpedo the San Remo conference. They wanted to torpedo the outcome of the San Remo conference. And so they encouraged Haj Amin al-Husseini to undertake this pogrom in the old city of Jerusalem. And they created favorable a situation for him to be able to carry that out. And the British military intention was to demonstrate that a Jewish national home or Jewish state, whatever, was both undesirable and particularly unworkable. Now, they didn't succeed in torpedoing the outcome of the San Remo conference, but what they did was to create a legacy that haunted the rest of the British mandate over Palestine. And that, of course, continues to this day. It's not as if Haj Amin al-Husseini was prepared to compromise and make peace and accommodate a Jewish national home. If he had his way, he would have been rid of every last Jew in the Jewish homeland, and that is what is behind what is going on today. The Palestinian Authority, PLO, they've made a pretense of making peace, but what they want is the destruction of the Jewish state. And so this evil, murderous legacy lives on to this very day. And the very sad thing is that the British Foreign Office has tried to accommodate it. I mean, the so-called two-state solution is just, it's cloud cuckoo land. The two-state solution really is a sacred cow that needs to be slaughtered. And this is one of the things we're trying to do in Whose Land. First of all, look at the legal arguments, because what I've discovered in interviewing all of these really top legal experts, people like Professor Avi Bell, Professor Eugene Kontorovich, Dr. Alan Baker, who's with the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Dr. Cynthia Wallace, who used to work with the United Nations. These are top people, and just about, in fact, every single principle of international law that one can come up with actually favors the right of the Jewish people to take sovereignty over the whole of Judea, Samaria, and of course, Jerusalem. To give you an example, in 1988, the Jordanians renounced their sovereign claim over what they had renamed as the West Bank and Jerusalem. And they renounced it in favor of the so-called Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians are not mentioned in Resolution 242 because at that stage they weren't a recognizable entity in 1967. They weren't part of the Six-Day War, so they didn't actually exist as an entity. Okay, the PLO existed as a terrorist organization, and it still is a terrorist organization, but it did not exist. Now, when Jordan renounced her sovereignty in favor of the Palestinians, she was handing over stolen property. The boundaries, it's called uti possidetis juris, and as I said, it's a universal principle of international law that when a new entity or state comes into being, their borders, their international boundaries, are those that existed immediately before. Well, in 1948, on the 13th of May 1948, the eastern boundary of Palestine, as it was called, the Palestinian Mandate, was the Jordan River. And so when Israel became a state on the 14th of May 1948, that was the eastern boundary that Israel inherited in international law. Okay, I should say something else about this actually, which is if the Arabs had decided that they were going to go along with Resolution 181 of 1947, and a treaty, an agreement had been signed between the Palestinian Arab leadership and also the issue of the Jewish community of that time. If they had signed an agreement together, a peace agreement, and agreed with that partition plan, then that would have become international law. It would have become recognized, and the boundaries would have become recognized in international law. But the fact is, the Arabs rejected it out of hand and basically made Resolution 181 null and void. So the borders, as of the 14th of May, were the former British Mandate of Palestine, eastern boundary, the Jordan River. And these are all matters that we look at. So just about every principle of international law, every one that I know of, and I'm not a lawyer, I've interviewed some top lawyers, so hopefully I've got a bit of an understanding of this, is in Israel's favor. And the only way the Palestinian Arabs and the whole BDS movement can actually make a case is to tell lie after lie after lie.
Tell me something about in your views, the illegitimacy of the horrible UN Security Council Resolution 2334, which was put up by President Obama as he was leaving the White House with Biden. Why do you say it's inadmissible?
Well, several things. Going back to the San Remo Conference and the mandate, that was an international treaty which gave the Jewish people rights. Now, the League of Nations mandates, the rights given to the people, the beneficiaries of those mandates, were carried through into Article 80 of the UN Charter. Now, the UN Charter itself is legally binding in international law. It's in itself, it's a treaty. Now, so the rights of the Jewish people to reconstitute their homeland, and the heartland of the Jewish homeland, of course, is Jerusalem, which is their ancient capital city, going back 3,000 years, and Judea and Samaria, historically 3,000 years. So the rights of the Jewish people to their historic homeland are enshrined in the UN Charter. Now, Resolution 2334, which was, of course, in the dying days of the Obama administration, and by the way, the British Foreign Office was very instrumental in drafting that. Theresa May was the Prime Minister at the time, but they were instrumental in drafting that, and she was actually infuriated by it. She really was. She was very annoyed about it, because I think actually what Obama was wanting to do was to take it further and have a Chapter 7 resolution passed. But Theresa May actually opposed that. But what I want to say here, that this resolution 2334, which declared, there was a Chapter 6 resolution, which is not legally binding, declared, the UN declared that any Jewish presence in the so-called occupied Palestinian territories, that is the ancient Jewish capital and the historic homeland, was a gross violation of international law. They didn't word it quite like, they used the word gross violation of international law, but of course they don't use the historic names for the territory. They just say occupied Palestinian territory. So they claim that it's a Jewish presence there, or occupation, if you like. There is no occupation. As I said earlier, the only occupation was between 1948 and 1967. Anyway, they say it's a gross violation of international law. Well, the UN Charter, which is a binding agreement or treaty, says otherwise. So it's a lie.
As you rightly said, it was taking place in Obama's dying days as President of the United States, and his point person for the Ukraine was Biden. And he appointed Biden to make sure that Ukraine, who was sitting at that time on the United Nations Security Council, was still going to vote on behalf of the Obama resolution. In other words, both Obama and Biden stuck the knife in Israel's back as they were heading out of the White House. I'm saying this just days in advance of the visit to Israel and to the Palestinian Authority of President Biden. An award-winning Arab journalist, Khaled Abu Toma, has just written an article in which he was pointing out that a two-state solution would today be a gift to Hamas, because Hamas controls the Palestinian streets today. This is why you, Hugh, making this new version is vitally important. Tell us where you are right now with the Hugh's Land Part 2.
Well, it is well advanced, the production, but we've got a lot more work to do. I mean, I've assembled a lot of it, but we need to film more with our very good on-camera presenter, Colonel Richard Kemp, who I think is second to none. And we've got some more interviews that we need to film with various lawyers. Areas that we haven't covered since part 1 was finished was the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, the US embassy to Jerusalem. We haven't covered the Abraham Accords yet. And the other thing, which is a real danger to Israel, is the UN Human Rights Council and of course this International Criminal Court case that's being put forward to try and prosecute Israeli politicians and military leaders and so on. So this is an area we need to also work on. I am due in the next, before the end of July, to film an interview with Danny Danon, which he will talk about all of this, and including Resolution 2334, which we just discussed, because he was Israel's ambassador at the UN at the time that happened, and it really shook him. So there's that to happen. But our big thing that's holding us back at the moment is a lack of funds, and really our being able to finish this, and we need to try and finish it by the end of the year, is funding. And I don't know whether I have your permission to talk about that, but that's where we are. Otherwise, once again, the whole production comes to a halt.
No, it's vitally important that you get the funding. If people watching this or hear about this want to help you, organizations or individuals, how do they contact you?
Okay, now we need to raise the equivalent of just about 150,000 US dollars, and they can go to our website, www.whoseland, that's one word, whoseland.tv. You can donate there on the website, or if you want to talk to me, you can get in touch with me at my email address, which is hugh.kitson@titledeedmedia.com, and we can talk about that further. But it's something that's vital, and I believe that one of the things is we want to reach leaders, political leaders, and very early on, after the release of Part 1, Richard Kemp actually took Whose Land DVDs into the White House. He had meetings in the White House with a number of President Trump's advisors, one of them David Friedman, another Jason Greenblatt, and others as well. And so they were given this. Australian prime ministers, because by the way, Title Deed Media is registered in Australia. I've got Australian citizenship as well as British. And it's been given to Australian leaders, certainly two of the previous prime ministers if not three, have been given it by the various Jewish organizations out there. And it's to give it to political leaders is vital. We've not been so successful here to date, although hopefully we're making some ground here in the UK now, because actually we've probably got the most pro-Israel cabinet here in Britain than we've certainly had since Maggie Thatcher's days, perhaps even before that. So if ever there is going to be an apology by the British government for the situation that exists, because let's face it, the conflict we have now is a legacy of the British Mandate and our betrayal all of those years ago. If ever that's going to happen, it's going to happen now. And so there's a real urgency to make Israel's case. But one of the very sad things that I've encountered and I'm witnessing is that within the Jewish communities in various nations, in America, here in Britain, and even to some degree in Australia, because I'm well connected with the Jewish community in Australia, there is division over Israel. And one of the reasons for that division, of course, is the misinformation in the media, the lies that the media tell, which so many people believe. And so, as much as anything, I believe that Whose Land, and I'm not Jewish at all, and neither is Colonel Richard Kemp. In fact, all of our production entity, or nearly all of our production entity, were all Gentiles. But my observation is that Jewish people need to know their history and their legal rights, and that the lies that are told in the media just need to be counteracted. And the best way to counteract this is to tell the truth. And as we showed Part 1 around the world, we did an Australian tour with it. showed it in cinemas. We've had many screenings here in the United Kingdom, which UK Lawyers for Israel actually facilitated many of those. We found that the Jewish audiences in particular, they just sort of went, wow, we never knew that. And so there's a real need, I believe, to educate the Jewish community. Now, I should say about Whose Land, in Israel, I think the educational system in Israel needs to take it on. Well, we've now got it with Hebrew subtitles. We've got the full-length version with Hebrew subtitles. We've got the abridged version with Hebrew subtitles on it. And this is going to be shown at the Begin Center on the 27th of this month, July. We're having the Jerusalem premiere, and I'll be out there for that. And we've also got the 10-minute episodes with Hebrew subtitles on it. And so if somehow we can get this shown in Israel as well, I believe it'll be of great value there. I hope so.
If anybody over there, anywhere else, wants to have a screening of Whose Land and possibly have a seminar or a conference alongside with it, how can they obtain copies? And again, let me repeat again, how can they contact you in order to have copies sent to them and having organizations or even a speaking tour of, for instance, the United States, Canada?
We've also, Richard Kemp and I, did a webinar a couple of years ago with the Zionist Organization of America, and the Canadian Israel is CLIR, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, are actually going to put it up on their website, similarly to what UK Lawyers for Israel have done. And by the way, if you go to UK LFIcharity.com, you can find on their resources page there a complete breakdown of Whose Land. It's got the content in web. You can get a description of what's in the film there, and you can also watch the various episodes. Well, the Canadian organization is going to do that. But I'd like to see the Zionist Organization of America do the same thing as well, because and Think, who I mentioned earlier, and Tucker, they have the episodes up on their website as well. So we need to get it out there, and I'd be very happy, Barry, if you put it up on your website, these episodes. The material, the descriptive material, would need to be translated into Hebrew, but the videos certainly have got Hebrew subtitles on them anyway.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do also, as I mentioned before, about trying to open up an American market for you. That also, hopefully, please God, will also put you in contact with certain donors and sponsors who feel the importance of the message you're putting across.
Yes.
Hugh Kitson, I want to thank you and bless you from Israel for all you're doing for Israel. You're perfect example of what I've written about in some of these books I've got behind me, of the Christian Zionists who go way even beyond a lot of what our Jewish supporters do. Thank you. God bless you for all you're doing. More power to your pen, to your filmmaking, and long may you continue. Thank you, Hugh Kitson.
If any of your viewers are in Israel on the 27th of July, you'd be welcome to come along to the Begin Center at 6:30 in the evening and take part in the Jerusalem premiere of Whose Land.
Thank you, Hugh. Hugh Kitson, God bless you. This is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel. Please share this video with others. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
هاي تل الربيع شوف كان تسميتها تل الربيع بعد احتلال يافا. كانت يافا هون فصارت تل الربيع.
هاي أرض الميعاد، هم بفكروا اليهود إنها ميعاد إلهم، لكن هي ميعاد لتجميعهم للقضاء عليهم بأمر رب العباد.
لقد بنيت خطتي على نار الحقد والكراهية التي تملأ قلوب اليهود نحو محمد وأتباعه.
على ضياع هيبتنا بسبب محمد.
Joseph Goebbels, who was Hitler's architect of the campaign to brand the Jewish people as a subhuman race in Nazi Germany, was quoted as saying, "If a lie is repeated often enough, then the people will believe it." A similar tactic is being used today in the propaganda war waged against Israel by Islam and the pro-Palestinian factions in the Middle East.
لكن نحن في مدارسنا نعلم ما يوليه علينا ديننا وضميرنا، لأن القدس هي عربية، وأن فلسطين من شمالها لجنوبها من نهرها لبحرها هي عربية فلسطينية إسلامية، وستبقى كذلك رغم أنف هذا المحتل اللعين.
At the heart of the propaganda war against Israel is the use of fake history and lawfare, the revision and deliberate misrepresentation of international law. Whose Land is a documentary film looking at the legitimacy of Israel in international law, with a highly qualified group of historians and international lawyers.
San Remo, the Villa de Vachon. This is a place where legal rights were given to both the Jewish people and the Arab people. It was the Jewish people that were chosen to be the beneficiaries of a trust, a mandate under the care of the British government in respect to Palestine.
San Remo basically adopted the content of the Balfour Declaration, and it was approved by 51 countries, which was then the international community.
The international law that governs the settlements relies on the San Remo Conference. That is the basis. That's not been changed.
The San Remo Resolution of 1920, its unanimous endorsement by the League of Nations, and the mandate document which incorporated the Balfour Declaration is binding under international law to this day.
In formulating legally binding instruments, there was a recognition of the cultural, historic roots of the Jewish people in that land.
You see, they are recognizing a pre-existing right and not creating a new right. In other words, the historical rights of the Jewish people to this land were recognized by the great powers at the time, by the equivalent of the UN at the time.
Which means that if they can establish that they had a vibrant community in Jerusalem, or in Hebron, or in Shiloh, and in different areas of the Holy Land, they've been given the right to reconstitute these communities.
Article 80 of the UN Charter assumes the powers that were given to the League of Nations, so that anything that was decided under the League of Nations, such as the San Remo Resolution, such as the Mandate for Palestine, are still legally binding under the UN Charter.
It becomes part of international law.
At the same time, we will reveal that the Palestinian claim to any part of the land has no historical basis at all.
Of course, there was no Palestinian nation. Salah ad-Din, neither Dar el-Omar had in mind building an Arab-Palestinian nation as they write today in their history.
Nobody had any thoughts of Palestinian nationalism at that time, whatever, because there was no such place as a state of Palestine, and never had been. So nobody had gone for generations thinking, I'm a Palestinian.
So the name Palestine after 1948 was kind of adopted by the non-Jewish Palestinians, and they say, we are the true Palestinians. We belong in the land. We are the indigenous people. and these Jews came in later and created this colonial thing called Israel.
The Palestinian Authority tells their people that the Jewish people did not have a history in the land of Israel. And this is one of their fundamental principles of their ideology. And therefore they claim that there never was a Jewish presence in Jerusalem.
An UNESCO resolution that basically says that Jews and Israel do not have any connection to Jerusalem and the Temple Mount is something that should stay in history as the biggest lie.
Whose land does not set out to justify the right of Israel to exist. Instead, it simply tells the truth.
The attempt of the modern Palestinians to say, oh, we go back to antiquity, there always were Palestinians here, is rubbish in historical terms.
Media coverage of the Middle East and even United Nations resolutions use terminology such as occupied Palestinian territory and the illegal occupation. Is this terminology based on international law, or is it simply anti-Israel propaganda?
The term Palestinian territories, or occupied Palestinian territories, or OPT, which is used in virtually every General Assembly resolution in the UN, this expression has got absolutely no basis whatsoever. It's utter nonsense.
The Arab rejection of Resolution 181 precludes the Arabs from any legal claim they might otherwise have to that territory.
Jordan, Syria, Egypt had no claim to Jerusalem or the West Bank on the basis of any doctrinal principle of international law.
And so the Jewish settlements and the claim for Israel to exercise jurisdiction over the West Bank, I think, is legally supported, certainly by Article 80 of the UN Charter.
Will the two-state solution really bring peace to the Middle East?
The Palestinian Authority, through the frameworks that it controls, television, Ministry of Education, goes out of its way to tell its children that Israelis can never be peace partners, because the problem is not land and the problem is not Israel. The problem is our essence as Jews.
أعداء الله أبناء الخنازير وقطعوا أسلاءهم بالحجارة والسكاكين ودنسوا كتاب الله على الملايين. أين أمة الإسلام والمجاهدين؟ أين مخافة الله في القدس قد دنست بالصهايين.
I don't think that there is an interest of the Palestinian leader to solve the conflict.
نحيي كل ذرة دم أريقت في سبيل القدس، فهي دماء نظيفة، دماء نقية، دماء في سبيل الله إن شاء الله، وكل شهيد سيكون في الجنة وكل جريح سيكتب له الله الثواب. هذا الأقصى لنا والقيامة لنا، كلها لنا، لا يحق لهم أن يدنسوها بأقدامهم القذرة.
I think that the Oslo can be considered as that tragedy for the Palestinian people. In my opinion, the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian leadership are not acting since the Oslo Agreement until today as a leadership.
What Israel has had to do is effectively just give. And we've seen this for so long now that it seems to me to be an obvious part of Palestinian diplomacy. They just take.
A state needs to be built before it's recognized. And unfortunately, I didn't see neither the Palestinian Authority nor the international community are trying to build a Palestinian state.
The idea that you can make out of a state two completely different entities which are hostile to one another, where the president of one of them hasn't actually been elected, his term of office ended years ago, where the other one is an actual terrorist organisation, which is still firing rockets into its neighbour. That is not the kind of state that the United Nations should want amongst its members.
Join me, Richard Kemp, in the two-part documentary film Whose Land, as we uncover the true story behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
אנו מכריזים בזאת